Today, there is no bigger story than the historic overturning of the use of affirmative action in college admissions. From President Biden to former President Donald Trump, folks are talking about this decision and what it means for diversity on college campuses, what it might mean even in hiring, and the use of race in decisions about who is hiring. We know that Reverend Al Sharpton today talked about his concern that it may also mean retrenchment or setback in terms of organizations that have supported those civil rights and social justice groups that are working on issues of equity and justice in this country. How might those funders, how might those foundations view this decision? Might they use this as an excuse or an explanation for why they are pulling funding for certain initiatives that advance equity in our society? There were some scathing words from Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. She called out Clarence Thomas, Justice Thomas. Justice Thomas called out Ketanji Brown Jackson. I'm going to talk to some experts in this hour about what this decision means, what it means for college campuses, what it means for higher education, and what it means, or says, I should say, about our Supreme Court, particularly given the way we saw justices calling each other out. Is this a court that has lost its legitimacy? Have the people of America, has the American people lost trust in this court? In her fiery dissent, the only Black woman on the U.S. Supreme Court, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, said this in the case involving the University of North Carolina. With let them eat cake obliviousness today, the majority pulls the ripcord and announces colorblindness for all by legal fiat. But deeming race irrelevant in law does not make it so in life, she wrote. No one benefits from ignorance. Although formal race-linked legal barriers are gone, race still matters to the lived experiences of all Americans in innumerable ways, and today's ruling makes things worse, not better. Joining me in this hour is Sally Chen, Education Equity Policy Manager, Chinese for Affirmative Action, Margalynne Armstrong, Associate Professor, Santa Clara School of Law, and Marita Etcubañez, who's the Vice President of Strategic Initiatives for Asian Americans Advancing Justice. Welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for joining me on this historic day for a discussion about this devastating, is the best way I can call it, decision handed down in a 6-3 decision by the U.S. Supreme Court. I want to start with you, Sally. What was your reaction when you got the news, got the alert on your phone? In the same way that most of us did when you heard how the court had decided the affirmative action cases.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. And yes, it was a rude wake-up call this morning on Pacific time. I was both disappointed and really frustrated to see the content of today's Supreme Court decision. It goes against history, facts, and the court's own precedent. We know that race and racial diversity are really important, and that the benefits of diversity are well documented, despite what the opinion writes about without any kind of citation or actual exploration of facts. And I'm really sad to see that so much of that played out without the voices of students and alumni. I'm one of the 8 students and alumni that testified in the SFFA versus Harvard lawsuit in support of affirmative action. Not a single student was put forward by Students for Fair Admissions, let alone any Asian American students. And so there was not a single voice that testified to being harmed by race-conscious policy. It's actually the opposite. I feel, honestly, a lot of grief for the student voices that are left unheard in this case.
Yeah, and Marita, let me ask you, I know you were at a press conference in Washington earlier with civil rights activists and leaders. What was that press conference's focus, and what's your response to this decision?
I would characterize the response as intense disappointment, as well as outrage, but also firm resolve that we are going to do everything within our power to advance educational equity, protect diversity, and muster our collective communities to recommit to the work of racial justice.
So I know, Marita, that you are with Asian Americans Advancing Justice. Earlier in my news segment, I read a poll that said that the majority of Asians, like the majority of whites, are opposed to affirmative action. And I was on a show this morning myself because I've interviewed you before, and I know that it's not true that all Asians are opposed to affirmative action. Can you give us your sense about where Asian Americans are on this issue and how maybe the news media is misreporting about the feelings around affirmative action in the Asian community?
Thank you very much for that question. I so appreciate it. You know, the Asian American community is not a monolith. We are tremendously diverse. We are made up of people with origins from East Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, the Pacific Islands. And like all communities, there are differences of opinion among us. I dare say that the minority of Asian Americans that oppose affirmative action those are voices that I think the media has been eager to lift up and share, to the point where, unfortunately, I feel like public narratives have skewed to where people feel that that minority of voices represents the broader community, which it absolutely does not. We also have polling data, including the 2022 Asian American Voter Survey, that demonstrates that a significant majority of Asian Americans support affirmative action. And in fact, the number is 69%. I believe the study that you are referencing is from Pew.
Right, correct.
And so the way that one asks questions really matters when it comes to polling, right? Mm-hmm. And I have looked at that data too, and it actually shows that the majority of Asian Americans support affirmative action. But there is another question in that polling that asks about support for race-conscious admissions. And that is where many people signaled that they don't support race-conscious admissions. Now, we know that the two are actually the same.
Right.
So I think it points to a continuing need to educate our communities about the facts behind affirmative action and race-conscious admissions.
And I'm glad you brought that up. So obviously the way questions are asked on a poll will determine the outcome, how people respond, and they can literally give different responses to essentially the same question if that question is just worded slightly differently. So we have to be careful about putting too much emphasis on polling data. And thank you for setting the record straight about the fact that the majority of folks in your poll, Asian Americans, support affirmative action. But I think that brings us to a really important point, Professor Armstrong, and that is the way that affirmative action is characterized. And depending on who you talk to or who you listen to, it takes on various definitions, some of which are not consistent and some of which are not accurate. Given that you are a constitutional law professor at a very highly esteemed law school, give us the definition of affirmative action, its origins, and how we should be thinking about it, as we're going to be hearing so many people opine about it over the next several weeks, months, and years.
Well, the term affirmative action was actually began in hiring under President Kennedy. And that term, as used with respect to admissions in universities, has really evolved over the years. So the first case that looked at affirmative action was the case at Davis, the Bakke case, and the University of Davis Law School had a quota system. And the court found that quotas were unconstitutional. And they pointed to the system that they were using at Harvard, which considered diversity among other factors in an applicant's total picture. So Harvard had a holistic approach to considering all types of characteristics. Harvard was long in the practice of trying to get a variety of people from all of the states in the country, because Harvard felt that it was educating future leaders, and every state has leaders. So for many, many years, where you resided was a major factor. And of course, in addition to considering your grades and the standardized test, people got consideration for their talents, particularly sports. In schools like Harvard, there's legacy considerations. If you have a parent who was an alum, particularly one who's generous to the school in terms of contributions, that could affect your admissions. So all kinds of things go into the decision as to who can come. And for Harvard, race was a consideration, but it didn't weigh as much as other factors did. And certainly, Harvard says that people weren't rejected because of their race. And one of the really interesting things about affirmative action, and particularly white people, is that affirmative action has never excluded whites as a whole group from any school, whereas the schools that we're looking at today expressly did not admit Blacks. That's the University of North Carolina. And Harvard also had very few Blacks coming through the school. Now, Harvard was known for limiting the number of Jewish applicants or admits to the school. And that's one of the reasons, actually, that the quotas at UC Davis were rejected by Justice Moss, because he had a real resentment of the quotas that had been used by Harvard. Now, back when they had those quotas, it wasn't illegal, really. It's really because of the federal funding that schools receive under Title VI that makes them subject to this constitutional analysis, which is really based on equal protection. But the court applies the same analysis for equal protection and the Title VI cases like Harvard private schools.
Yeah, thank you for that historical kind of perspective on how affirmative action, the first case, the Bakke decision, and how it has evolved. Sally, I know you said you were one of the students that testified when this case was at the district court level. Did you see the Ed Blum press conference today?
I saw parts of it, but not the whole thing.
One of the things he said that caught my attention was that they being this organization's, Students for Fair Admissions, is going to be looking very closely to see if universities are adhering to this decision, and they are willing, ready, and able to initiate additional litigation to sue schools that, in their opinion, are not adhering to it. And he said that what adherence looks like to him, in part, is eliminating the box or the question on any application for colleges that ask you your race. What do you think about that?
I think that this case has and continues to spread a lot of misinformation and disinformation about what happens in college admissions. A lot of my work at my current organization focused on civic engagement and in-language media and disinformation sharing, fact-checking, myth-busting, a lot of what is sent out. to add on to what Marita had said, I really see this confusion around what is happening when colleges and universities consider race holistically as part of the problem around what is happening in polling. When we see that when you lead with values, that a lot of Asian American respondents understand the need for diversity, for ending segregation, for integration, but a lot of confusion when they just see, oh, the use of race in admissions. And I think the confusion around the check the box idea as well. This is something that Professor Armstrong had mentioned. No one is excluded or admitted to a school solely based on their race. And in fact, I have concerns around the lack of data and tracking that we will have if we don't have a bare minimum collection of information to see how we are doing in terms of our colleges and universities' stated goals for racial diversity.
Yeah, well, according to the financial person that's really backing the Students for Fair Admission, Marita, he says that one way that you're going to demonstrate adherence to the elimination of race as a factor in admissions is by not even asking about race. And we know that the conservative majority on the court talked about this colorblind, notion that somehow using race was in and of itself discriminatory, and that by eliminating race as a factor, as Clarence Thomas said, he's an originalist and he's defending the colorblind Constitution. He goes on to say all forms of discrimination based on race, including so-called affirmative action, are prohibited under the Constitution. What do you make of this? Clarence Thomas felt the need to write his own opinion and to take pot shots at Ketanji Brown Jackson. He said Justice Jackson would replace the second founder's vision with an organizing principle based on race. In fact, on her view, almost all of life's outcomes may be unhesitatingly ascribed to race. Basically, he says Justice Jackson sees race everywhere. So, Marita, I was getting your response to some of the comments that Clarence Thomas made in his concurring opinion. I'm going to talk to Professor Armstrong about his whole originalist defense, but even his, the dig he takes at Justice Jackson, suggesting that basically she sees race in everything and trying to, I guess, take her to task for her dissent. What do you make of that?
Colorblindness has never been the goal of civil rights. I think most people understand the value of diversity, see diversity as a good thing. And colorblindness is not what we should be aspiring to. We want students to be able to tell their full stories, to share their lived experiences, including their experiences with discrimination. And a colorblind approach would erase all of that. We cannot grapple with racism without talking about race. It's upside down, it's misguided. Like, we could all offer many, many adjectives for what is wrong with that approach. It's disappointing that there are so many that want to take our country there. Really, we need to be able to talk about race. We know that we have a long history of racism in this country, but it is very much still with us today. I don't think anyone here would say otherwise. I mean, with the Asian American community, for instance, there are many people who don't feel that our communities are discriminated against. And yet, with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw that our communities were targeted and blamed for COVID-19. Racism still very much exists. It is part of our current reality, and turning a blind eye to racism is not the answer. That is not the way to move us forward.
Yeah, we see a lot of Pollyannish talk, a lot of naive comments that were made today. Mike Pence came on national television from the Ukraine talking about there might have been a time in this country when we needed to consider race, but that time is gone. He mentioned his 3 white children and their college education as if somehow they were examples of the reality that racism no longer exists. And we often hear folks trying to glom onto Dr. King's, one of his speeches where he talks about judging people not on the color of their skin, but the content of their character. So we see all of these really, really gaslighting attempts, I call them, because that's what it is, suggesting that this is a colorblind society when this whole country was built on color. And if you were the quote unquote right color, white, you always enjoyed certain privileges and rights in this country. And if you were not white, you were always treated as less than. And I love when Justice Jackson, Professor Armstrong, said, Clarence Thomas is responding to a dissent I did not write. And she says it demonstrates an obsession with race consciousness that far outstrips my or UNC's. Help us understand what Clarence Thomas meant when he said, if you can get in his head, when he said he's an originalist and he's somehow defending a colorblind constitution. We know that's a fallacious statement, but help us at least try to understand what this argument from this man who himself has been the beneficiary of affirmative action, which is so makes his statements even more galling. But talk to us about Clarence Thomas.
When he talks about originalism, he tries to recreate how the Constitution would have been interpreted at the time that it was written. In this case, the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment after the Civil War. Now, it's a pretty kind of ridiculous attempt because there is no one understanding of what the Constitution meant at any given point. And so by saying that he can determine what it is that was specifically intended, first of all, freezes the Constitution to what the world was like at the end of the Civil War, in this particular case, at the end of the American Revolution, when you talk about originalism for other parts of the Constitution. So he is trying to say this is what it meant at the time that it was ratified, which is really a kind of futile task. He looks to history, but Justice Brown can look at the same history and point to a very different meaning behind those words. Plus, so much has happened since the time that the 14th Amendment was ratified. The 14th Amendment was nullified by the Supreme Court for 70 years. It did not protect people. At least equal protection did not protect people. So to try to impose a meaning that was never fully accomplished and that was cut in its prime is certainly ridiculous. And this obsession with color blindness, this comes from Edward Bloom, who has been trying to destroy affirmative action for years and years. His organization looks for students that he can use as plaintiffs. And it occurred to him that if he found Asian American students, he would have a more sympathetic way of approaching the destruction of affirmative action. But this is just another illustration of how the Supreme Court is really manipulated by political considerations. Edward Bloom isn't wealthy, but his organization, the Students for Fair Admissions, is funded by billionaires. And we have Alito and we have Thomas, who are taking these vacations at the expense of these billionaires. And now these billionaires who are completely screened by this organization, because Bloom isn't like a hugely wealthy person, they are getting their agenda carried out completely.
Right. And that's what's so, again, galling about this is there's this facade of impartiality by this Supreme Court. And we now know and they've been exposed, Alito and Clarence Thomas, that they are in bed with these GOP billionaire donors, and to suggest that they somehow can rule on these cases in a way that's impartial is laughable to begin with. I do want to talk to you, though, Sally, about what Professor said about how Edward Bloom and Students for Fair Admissions recruited these Asian students because they knew that they would be more sympathetic, because the traditional thinking, particularly in a state like California, when you look at our UC system, is that Asian students are predominant on many of the elite college campuses. So a lot of people are scratching their heads saying, what is it, what's this notion that somehow Asian students are being discriminated against? Help us understand what the numbers are around Asian students and admissions and their numbers on college campuses.
Right. When I try to break this down in a couple steps, I usually say first that we know college admissions is not fair. We can look at Varsity Blues, we can look at all the discussion about legacy recruitment, and we can establish that. Second, that we know that Asian Americans face barriers to education, whether we are not a monolith, we include a large number of first-generation students, limited English-speaking students, students of different immigration statuses. There's a lot of real need that we see. But third, that Ed Bloom is bringing this case forward in a way that is just meant to attack affirmative action under the cover of addressing education equity or discrimination against Asian Americans won't actually, it's just a false cover for what he has been trying to advance all along. And as part of that, advocates know that we actually do need to continue the work, that affirmative action was not meant to be a cure-all for education inequity, for racial discrimination in the K through 12 higher education space, that actually there is so much more that we need to do to protect our progress and to expand opportunity and push back against the idea that this access to education is a zero-sum game, when we know that we actually need to build a world where all students are able to succeed. And it shouldn't be that when the Supreme Court says something like, if someone gets a spot, someone loses a spot, it's really faulty logic. We're looking at a framework where the assumption is that education is something to be earned as opposed to a public good. And we really need to step back and think about how these false claims about equality are really hamstringing our attempts to talk about equity and talk about real access.
Professor Armstrong, the majority opinion seems to leave open this very narrow window that universities may be able to use. They talk about students talking about their race in their application, specifically their essay. What do you make of that? Do you think universities will be able to use that narrow window to continue to diversify its student body?
Well, since race isn't taken as a factor in and of itself, this is an opportunity for a student to write about how they've persevered against odds and against racism, or perhaps how their background has filtered their worldview. And so what the court is saying, students can still talk about race if they want to on their application, but the school somehow has to consider this discussion about race in a way that doesn't give the student any credit for race per se, but what race tells you about that particular applicant. And so what the court is saying is that you can't treat race as meaning one thing, which I don't think schools were doing. I mean, there's so much diversity among every different ethnic and racial group in the country, but essentially the schools cannot have a category that gives extra consideration to race. But you can't tell people that they can't talk about something. It would be impossible to enforce, and will probably raise First Amendment issues. So,
do you agree with Ed Bloom that this ruling requires universities to take off their applications the question check the box if you're African American or how you identify, blah, blah, the different categories? Do you think universities are obligated to do that?
Well, I don't think so. Again, I think Sally may have mentioned the statistical information that the schools are compiling about, who it is they're serving and who their students are. So technically, I don't see why they would have to say they can't gather that kind of information. But if they did take boxes off, they could require students to submit their photos with their applications. I mean, it's really
there are other ways to get that information, is your point. I got you. Let me ask you this, Marita. Again, going back to that press conference that you were at earlier today in Washington, D.C. with those civil rights leaders, what's the next step? Like, what's happening next? What's the ground plan to fight back on what appears and what feels like an attack on communities of color, minority students?
The attack is real, but we are fighting, and we will continue to fight. I think first it's important to understand that we want universities to re-examine their admissions policies, try to get a firm understanding of what this decision says, but also continue to find ways to support diversity. The case is limited to race-conscious admissions, right? There is so much that universities do and must continue to do to attract, support, and retain students of color. So there are many things that we encourage universities to continue and, in fact, expand many of those programs and practices, right? And again, this decision is limited to higher education and race-conscious admissions. So I understand the concerns that have been raised about how this decision might spill over into other arenas. But today's decision does not impact affirmative action in employment, in government contracting, in philanthropic giving. We certainly don't want to see corporations step back from their diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. If they are, one has to wonder whether that was just a way of marketing or if they were actually committed to supporting diversity. So I think first we have to make clear what this decision does not do, but then also assure everyone that we are in the fight, and we encourage students to still pursue their educational dreams and apply to these schools. And as others have already said, talk about your lived experiences as a person of color in the United States.
Sally, one of the things we've heard a lot about are these so-called proxies, things that universities can use to get to the issue of race. So Professor Armstrong said, don't check a box, send me your photo. Other folks say, tell me your economic status. We know economics tracks very closely with race in a lot of situations. Do you think universities are going to have to come up with new ways to get at this same information so that they can ensure that we don't see, like we saw in California with Prop 209 and the elimination of the use of affirmative action in admission to the UC system? We saw a 50% drop in minority students on campuses. And some say it's taken 25, 30 years to get back to that level pre-Prop 209, and that we're still not back there. I know Black students at UCLA, for example, have struggled mightily over the decades to gain any traction at that university. So what kinds of ways do you see university, what tools do you see them using to ensure diversity?
I see colleges and universities needing to learn from the experiences of states where affirmative action has already been banned, necessarily California and Michigan. There are lots of schools that have had experiences trying to explore what programs and policies worked for their institutions and what has not worked. And to see, too, the need to pour resources into exploring more options that are relevant to the local communities or the specific communities that they want to be serving. I see a lot of the work ahead for CAA in particular to be two-pronged in that area. One is to engage students and families to make sure that they know exactly what Marita said. They know what they should be talking about, which is exactly what has always been the point of education, for them to be fundamentally, unapologetically themselves to talk about who they are and be authentic, be genuine about that, and not feel that they need to hide who they are, and to apply for these schools and not feel any kind of hesitation in that. And the second, in our engagement with colleges and universities, Chinese for Affirmative Action is circulating a petition currently listing some of the other programs and policies that colleges can invest in that have been proven to support racial diversity in student admissions, including eliminating athletic and legacy recruitment, eliminating the use of SATs or ACTs, going test optional, investing in partnering at the K through 12 level for recruitment, preparation, mentorship programs, and supporting racial diversity after admissions, using disaggregated data to encourage diverse student matriculation. So looking at the students of color that were admitted and trying to encourage them to attend, whether that's through financial aid or other support programs, and finding ways to support that pathway.
Thank you for identifying those ways that schools can get involved in ensuring diversity on their campuses. We didn't see that happen in California after Prop 209, and we paid a big price for that in California. And hopefully universities will learn from those examples, and we will see them making the kind of investment that you just identified, because we know that we can diversify our campuses despite this historic decision. It's just a matter of will, and it's a matter of resources. Thanks so much, Sally. Thanks, Professor Armstrong. And thanks so much to you, Marita. Continue, all of you, doing this great work, lifting up this issue. We're going to stay on this because we are not going to go backwards. We're going to continue to forge ahead, and we're going to keep working for equity and justice in this country, despite those that would have it the other way.